Okay, everybody, thank you for joining another Prog Report Top 5 podcast. So far, we've had a really great run, some really great guests, and we hope you're enjoying all the podcasts and programming on Prog Report Radio, on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube. You can subscribe to all our channels and keep up with everything, all the news and info. Of course, follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the Prog Report for all upcoming news and interviews and everything else. Of course, we have today, because this band is kicking off something that's not common in Prague, and it's quite an achievement. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary, kicking off another tour, celebrating their humongous and historic catalog, and of course, they entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and you know them from all their great music. We're going to be covering the legendary Prog band Yes, which really needs no introduction. Of course, if you're listening to the Prog Report, you know all about Yes, and you own all their music, and you know all the tunes. So what I've been able to do here is bring two guests along that are really experts in the Yes world. They're going to put me to shame with their knowledge on it. I am just going to try and keep up. So first we have somebody that I guess you know very well now from his Yes Years podcast on the Prog Report Radio. And of course, he's joined us previously on some top fives. So we're bringing back Mr. Geoff Bailie from the UK.
Hello, Roy. Hello, John. Oh, sorry.
Oh, please say hi. Well, of course, the John that Geoff so kindly referred to is our special guest for today. Really accomplished broadcaster, music journalist, writer, and has worked with Yes over 30 years in every capacity. And he also hosts the Cruise to the Edge and the Moody Blues Cruise and all those sorts of things. So I'd like to welcome Jon Kirkman.
Hi, how you doing?
All right, thanks you guys for being here, John, especially. I know you're always a busy guy with all the stuff that you're doing, so thank you for taking a few minutes.
My pleasure.
Share your expertise. So we have quite a task here. I mean, this is a band that has 21 studio albums all the way from 1969, the self-titled debut, to 2014, Heaven and Earth, and everything in between, legendary things like Cruise to the Close to the Edge, Going for the One, Fragile, all those things. I'm sure we'll cover some of those. And I'm sure we can count on Geoff to throw in a few albums we have absolutely no expectation to be on the list. And that's why we brought him on. So Geoff, list albums at your own risk. And so real quick, guys, without giving too much away, because I'm sure we'll get into some more stories as we introduce our choices album-wise. But John, talk about, a little bit about first meeting the band and your introduction to them, sort of on a personal working relationship that you have.
Well, I first got into Yes via a British TV show called The Old Grey Whistle Test, and they had a TV special on called Live from the Rainbow, which was essentially Yes songs and what became Yes songs. And the first song that kind of hooked me was And You and I. So my very first tour that I saw live, and I was 15, was the Tales from Topographic Oceans tour, which a lot of people are going, wow, great. Big problem, when I saw them, the album hadn't come out. So you're listening to an entire double album before even hearing it and getting used to it. The first time I met them was, funnily enough, on the drama tour, and it was backstage at a gig near me called the D-Side Leisure Centre, and Chris Squire came right up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Chris." And I said, "Yeah, I know." So that was the first meeting. But I've worked with lots of the guys from Yes on various projects, and actually was involved in a Yes live album called Union Live. I was the executive producer on that particular release when it came out. So
I did not know that. That's pretty cool. I didn't know that.
I know. No, it was really funny. Somebody said, "I don't believe you," and I scanned the credits, and he said, "You could have photoshopped that," and I said, "Well, I didn't." But hey, whatever. But yeah, it's so that was an interesting. I put all that together for a company, and I worked with all of them. In fact, I just the deluxe edition of Chris Squire's Fish Out of Water. I worked with Chris on that in 2006. So that's just come out. We were going to do another one. So unfortunately, Chris took ill and sadly passed away before we could get that done.
I was watching you on my TV just last night, John, as I was waiting through that box set.
Well, you know.
Although I did have the original edition of it as well. That video.
Yeah,
but it was great.
It's
great to watch.
The new version. The new version is absolutely fantastic. I'm not just saying that because I'm part of it. It's my favorite solo Yes album, and that's not to diminish anything any of the other guys have done, but for me, that always was my favorite solo sort of Yes album, and it still is. It's a remarkable piece of music, and again, as I said, the new edition is absolutely amazing.
Great. Geoff, Geoff, you host our Yes Years 50 podcast, and Jon, basically what Geoff is doing is running through the 5 decades of Yes and going through just by segments of years. So, and one of them will be just 1971, 1981, and 1991, and so on. And then, playing a few tracks and talking about stories, and that's been very interesting to do. So Geoff, talk about your introduction to the band.
Okay, so my introduction, being slightly younger than their 50 years and being based in the UK, I suppose the first time I encountered any Yes elements would have been John and Vangelis being in the UK album charts, and then John Anderson guesting on Mike Oldfield's Crises album. He sang a track in that, and back in those days I was borrowing vinyl albums from my local public library, and I'd heard about this band Yes, and I went down and borrowed 3 albums, the 3 that they had, which were the Yes album, Drama, and 90125. And one of the things when I talk about the S Years podcast is that, so I got those 3 albums, and this is before the internet, so you couldn't really find out a lot about a band if you didn't know much about them. But what I did notice was between those 3 albums, there were 2 drummers, 2 keyboard players, 2 guitar players, 2 vocalists, and 1 bass player. And so the first thing I learned about Yes was it's a band where the lineup always changes. And I think that's part of why I've stayed a fan. I don't tend to belong to a faction. I sort of look at Yes music as a whole, irrespective of who's in the band. And I think then, in the show and in my own record collection, I've been delving deep into their solo careers. In fact, I got a Patrick Moraz CD through this morning that I'd never had before. And I just love exploring in and out and around the band. And like some of their albums better than others, but I'm a fan of Yes as a whole.
They certainly have no shortage of lineup changes, that's for sure. Jon, do you know the count by any chance of how many members they've had?
Well, when I did my book, I think it was 18. And I spoken to, I think, 16 or 17 of the 18 members of Yes at that time. I don't count Eddie Jobson. Not that Eddie Jobson isn't a wonderful musician, because he is. He's incredible. And all the work he's done over the years with bands like Curb There in UK and with Frank Zappa. And I think he's an amazing musician. But according to Trevor Rabin, he was literally only in a matter of weeks, although he was considered a full-time member at the time. He didn't actually tour with the band, and he didn't record with them. So I didn't interview Eddie, but I've spoken to him, of course, but because he's been on Cruise to the Edge a couple of times, and a lovely guy he is as well. But I think it's about 18.
Yeah, that's
what slightly more than that now.
I think that's what I've read as well, but you never know if you're forgetting someone with this many people. All right, cool. So good intros. We're going to kick off, basically, we're going to go through the any album is fair game, any era, any lineup you want to choose. And I guess I'm going to kick it off with, I think it's going to be a rare one on this list, but, we'll find out, because I got into the band in the 80s. My introduction to the band was 90125. That's not my choice here, but that was my intro. And after that was Big Generator. And so Yes, for me, was Trevor Rabin. That was before I really got a little older and started going back into, Fragile and some of those things. So the Trevor Rabin lineup, and Trevor Rabin himself was one of my favorite musicians. His solo album was a favorite album of mine growing up, Can't Look Away. And so when the band came back in 94 with Talk, I was thrilled, and I love that album. And I think it's a great album. And unfortunately, the story why that album sort of failed, and John, I'm sure you know, is that the record label that they signed with for that album ran out of money, and there was no promotion, and no one ever knew about that album. And one of the things I remember about it was I actually went to see them on that tour, and it was supposed to be like some big surround sound speaker thing and an arena and everything. And they were playing down here in Miami at the time at the big basketball arena, nice size place, good 20,000 seater or something. And it was really not full. Like, I mean, it seemed like no one knew the show was there. And I think, again, that had to do with the record label probably at the time just saying, hey, you go out and do it because we have no money to promote this thing. So that would be my guess anyway, because it still was Yes, and they still had a fairly popular fan base at the time. So anyway, my choice for number 5 is Talk. I love the epics on it, The Calling, Endless Dream, that whole suite at the end. There's a couple of songs that Trevor Rabin wrote with Roger Hudson, which were really cool and poppy, and I'm a big Supertramp fan. So I'm going to go with Talk at number 5. I think that's maybe my left curve choice, but I felt like I wanted to include that in here.
Well, I actually really love Talk, and I think it's a totally underrated album. And there's some great material on there, but it had a difficult birth, according to Trevor Rabin, because it was recorded digitally, and a bit like a sort of modern day Sgt. Pepper, where the Beatles put 2 4-track machines together. Yes, put 2 computers together in order to give themselves the tracks to work with. And when they were actually recording, Trevor told me the guy from the computer company and the software company was talking to his head office every night, trying to get new codes in order to make it happen for them the next day. And Trevor actually said it took a couple of years off my life working on that album, believe me. So, but it's a great record, a fabulous record.
Yeah. I agree. I was actually reading an interview with Tony Kaye that I found, and he described it as, Trevor's total vision for Yes. I mean, he seemed to suggest that Trevor was very much completely in control of this one, and that was sort of the terms on which he made it. And I think the studio that we talked about there was Trevor's garage.
It was,
and so it was very much crafted, but an awful lot of Jon in there too. I think probably not that much of anybody else, but.
Well, there's some beautiful vocals from Jon on there, like I Am Waiting, which is just amazing. And and actually the ARW lineup on their second run that they did here, they added that song to the set. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for agreeing with me slightly on there, which is cool. All right, we're going to jump to Geoff, your first choice, your number 5.
Okay, well, I maybe don't have as many curveballs as you might think, but I think my number 5 is probably my least predictable choice, and what I think is the great overlooked Yes album, or block of material. So I'm going to go for the album that's called Keys Studio, which is a compilation of the studio tracks that were on the Keys to Ascension 1 and 2 album. This was Anderson Howe, Squire, Wakeman White, getting back together, produced by Billy Sherwood, mostly long songs, short songs, epics like Mind Drive, that is shorter, poppier songs. But when you look at the credits for that album, songs are composed pretty much by every band. Every band member has a hand in writing. You've got Billy Sherwood, who's completely a massive fan, so who is sympathetic in terms of what Yes should sound like. how it should be produced without maybe the interference that albums like Union or ABWH that went before it would have had. And I know that Rick Wakeman said at the time he left after that, I think, due to management issues. But, Rick was very much disappointed that particularly the 50-odd minutes from Keys to Ascension 2 ended up being stuck as a kind of second disc to a live album rather than actually being finished off and put out there. And I think, if we had been, if we're a lot of Yes World is waiting for new studio material from the Steve Howe, Alan White lineup or the Anderson, Rabin, Wakeman lineup. And I think if right now they produced an album like those tracks, the fans would be absolutely overwhelmed and say this is exactly what we've waited for and wanted. And yet that album came out mid-90s as sort of bonus tracks on live albums and disappeared. Most of it was never played live. But I think as a collection of songs, it's really, really great.
Well, that is a left field choice a little bit, so that's cool. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really good album, but I think you're absolutely right there, Geoff. I think the actual marketing was totally wrong. They should have just put it all together as a studio album rather than tag them on to 2 volumes of a live album. I think the live album should have been Live from San Obispo, and then Keys to Ascension should have been the title of the studio.
Oh, absolutely. I think it was. I thought it was confusing myself when it first came out. Because you didn't know if it's a live album with just some extra garbage bonus tracks, which some bands do. You didn't really feel like it was a new album necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, it had the look and the feel of a contractual obligation album, but when you hear it, there's no contractual obligation there at all. This is Yes firing literally on all cylinders, and I think it's probably one of their better latter day albums. And it's sad because a lot of people, even Yes fans, are a little bit unaware of that, and it kind of fell through the racks, sadly. It's a really good album.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, cool. John, let's see what you got. Number 5.
Well, this is probably going to make a few people laugh because parts of it I love and parts of it I am not a big fan of. And my number 5, and because I mentioned it earlier, I went to see Yes on the Tales from Topographic Oceans tour, and they played the whole of the album before I'd even heard it. But my number 5 is the album Tales from Topographic Oceans. And the reason is it's worth having for the track number 1, The Revealing Science of God, and track number 4, Ritual, Nous Sommes du Soleil. I'm not too keen on sides 2 and 3 of their album. They have their moments, but I think Rick Wakeman summed it up very well by saying there's a lot of padding, and I think that padding actually comes in on sides 2 and 3.
Right.
There's some great parts of it, but for me, it's definitely sides 1 and 4, which of course they went out and played in the last 18 months or so.
Yeah,
that's my number 5, and I still love that album, and I still play The Revealing Science of God literally once a week. It's a wonderful track.
It's good to see that album, I think over the last 5-10 years, really started getting more appreciated, I think, than it did when it first came out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think at the time, a lot of people thought it might have been a bridge too far. What, 4 sides, just 4 tracks?
Yeah.
And not many bands have really done that. I mean, I think before that, really, it had been the realms of classical music where you just had 1 track per side, like a symphony or whatever. And I think, Yes, we're breaking new ground in many ways there. And like I said, I think it's lasted a lot longer than some of the other albums because people keep kind of going back to it and feel they ought to reinvestigate it.
Yeah.
And but there's some of the most wonderful melodies on that album that you will find from any band, not least Yes.
Yeah.
What I also remember, which was really a surprise on that the Progressive Nation at Sea cruise, where John Anderson joined Transatlantic that last night.
Yeah.
Everybody knew he was going to do that, and you figured, okay, he's going to come out. They're going to do Roundabout and Starship Trooper and whatever. And then the first song that he made the band learn and play was the side one of Topographic Oceans. And now everybody was like, "You've got to be kidding! They're playing this!" And here we went for 20 minutes. It was pretty insane.
Well, let me tell you something funny about this, because I can remember. Now, bear in mind, I was 15 when I went to see the band on that tour. And at 15, you're a little bit impatient. And I'd sort of seen them doing sort of Close to the Edge and Yes songs. And I thought, wow, great. But they came on, they did Close to the Edge, opened up with Close to the Edge. And then John said, right, we're going to play our new album. And they played it in its entirety. And I remember telling Chris Squire, and I said, Revealing Signs of God, great. Halfway through side 2, I'm actually thinking, when are you going to play Something I Know? and he laughed and he said, we still don't quite get it right sometimes. And he said, I remember at the time thinking, well, I'll go with it. It was a lot of music to kind of digest in one sitting. And he said, of course, as you say, the album hadn't been out for the start of the tour. So he said, a lot of people were hearing it for the first time. And he said, I imagine there were 1 or 2 people felt the same way as you did. I said, well, I was 15. And I said, at that age, come on, get on with it.
Didn't Genesis do the same thing with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway?
They did.
They toured it and no one had just come out. No one had heard it yet. And they played the whole thing.
Well, no, not before the UK. The album came out in the November in the UK, and we didn't see them until the following April. So we kind of had time to digest that. I mean, I think it was a bit different in America. But in the UK, we had time to get used to it. But I was hearing Tales from Topographic Oceans before I'd ever heard a note, and I was hearing it for the very first time live.
That's awesome. Looking back, it's pretty special, although
it is, and it was.
Yeah.
I have to admit, it's an album I didn't pay much attention to until they did Ritual on the Symphonic Tour, which I saw in Dublin, and that was the point where, for me, seeing it live was actually what kind of turned me on to it, really.
It's funny, actually, on the recent tour, though, a lot of people have been saying, why are they only playing sides 1 and 4? I want to hear all of it. I'm thinking, I wonder if these people would have wanted to have heard all of it back in the day when they first did it. I mean, without hearing it. I mean, it's one of those things, really, isn't it? I mean, when time passes, you've got time to get used to something.
Right.
So I think at the time when it's happening, you're not always aware of where things are going and how to sort of take them on board or absorb them.
Yeah, no, 100%. All right, well, those are really good choices for the beginning. All right, I'm gonna go on with my number 4, and I was debating between this and the other sort of big hit album to put on here, but I went with Fragile, 1971, the big celebrated album. I'm torn with this album sometimes, which is why maybe it's not a little bit higher for me, because I think some of it is the best music the band ever did. And then I just wish there was more songs on it. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the time of when it came out, when albums were shorter and, there wasn't this urgency to put on like 20 songs and that type of thing. And so there's a few shorter cuts and things that are on there, which are fine pieces of music, but when you want to sit and listen to an actual song, and that was always my minor sort of issue with it. But the standalone, longer songs are 4 of the best songs the band ever wrote. So, Roundabout, South Side of the Sky, Long Distance Runaround, and Heart of the Sunrise being possibly their best song. So I had to put that on the list. I think listening to it now from beginning to end, and when they played it in its entirety a few years ago on tour, you just realize what a brilliant piece of work it is. It's just, to be writing that kind of stuff back in 71, it's just insane and groundbreaking in every way.
Yeah, and I think what you've said is the reason why it's not in my top 5 is because I think as an album, it is a very iconic thing, but in terms of actually, if I had to pick 5 albums to not listen to any others, it probably wouldn't be in my list, simply because I think the shorter tracks, we talk about Tales having filler, I think that the shorter solo tracks are on the whole non-essential.
Well, I think if I can remember rightly, when Chris Squire was talking to me about that album, he said they had 6 weeks to make it, which if you think of only taking 6 weeks to make that album, it's not bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's why there's a lot of the solo things in. Plus, you bear in mind that Rick Wakeman had just joined the band, and the 4 tracks, I agree, Roy. I mean, South Side of the Sky, when they still do that now, it sends a shiver down my spine. It's an incredible track. Of course, when the band brought it to America, that was a big hit for them in America, and they had a big hit single with Roundabout. And they actually at the time did not like the edit of Roundabout. They just thought, it's a bit naff, I think, was what Steve Howe said and Chris Squire said. We weren't very excited by it, but the record company said, do it and you'll get radio play. And he said they were right, but I didn't think we needed to edit it. But it's an incredible album. And I think, as you say, when they performed it live in its entirety, I think you get the context of the whole album. But I think the shorter pieces were just there to give everyone a bit of a moment to shine. And as I said, because time was tight.
Yeah, it was sort of between, because the Yes album is a similar type of thing that also has like these iconic, massive hit songs that everybody knows with a few other ones thrown in between. And then this one. So, but I opted with this one just because the standalone songs on it, I think I like a little bit better. But either way,
Love comes to you, and then after, dream on to the heart of the sunrise. Short distance, how can the wind with its arms all around me? Short distance, how can the wind with so many around me? I feel lost in the city.
Geoff, your number 4.
Okay, my number 4. This is an album that I have to admit, despite being one of the first batch of 3 albums that I talked about getting, is an album I've really started to appreciate in full, I think, over the last few years. And that's 90125. And I think what I've come to recognize over the last number of years is, at the heart of it here, you have Cinema, a 3/4-piece band who are just an incredible rock band, rhythm section. I don't think the drums and bass sound better on any album, on any Yes album, than they do on 90125. And the Trevor Rabin, Chris Squire, John Anderson, and probably a little bit of Trevor Horn vocal harmony. Again, they are I believe they're the strongest vocals on any Yes album. And again, sort of perceived wisdom was John Anderson jumped on at the end and, just sort of sang what he was given. But I think there's I really do think John turned, some of Trevor's more formulaic sort of rock and love songs into something that truly became Yes. And, when so tracks like, Cinema, a really great progressive piece. City of Love, Hearts, Our Song, even the less well-known songs on that album are really, really strong. And, something like Leave It, and Owner of a Lonely Heart, but, remembered for their production, remembered for the Fairlights, remembered because they were singles. But actually, when you listen to them musically, the production is just absolutely incredible. They're just brilliant pieces of work, and that's an album that I've really come to love, that I didn't used to like that much, which is why it's my number 4.
Yeah, I mean, I love, like I said, that was my introduction to the band. A funny thing that I remember now, and it's really funny to me looking back on it, because you got to imagine I'm sort of a young kid at the time, and MTV was big, and I didn't know From Yes before, and you're seeing Owner of a Lonely Heart, and then I think the next single in America, at least with the video, was Leave It. And I honestly thought it was like Trevor Rabin was co-lead singer. I had no idea. They made him look like it, and those songs featured him, and the camera. One of the videos, if you look at I think it's Love Will Find a Way or Rhythm of Love, one of those videos that came out from Big Generator, they only show Trevor Rabin. Like it was, and Don Anderson, they never show in the videos. It was really a marketing thing because he was like the good-looking young guy, and they were trying to make him the star of the band.
Well, it's funny actually, because back in the day when it was cinema, Trevor was the lead singer. He was the lead singer in the band before Jon came in, and the record company said, "Look, we don't think this is going to work as a 4-piece. We think you need a frontman." And Trevor Horn was going to be the singer at one point, believe it or not. And then Chris said, "Well, I think I'll go and see Jon." And that's when Jon came in. But he did have a big input. He changed some of the lyrics around. And Trevor said, "No, that's fine. You do what you're going to do." And again, Trevor Horn changed some of the words around as well on things like Owner of a Lonely Heart. He's got a writer's credit. And he's actually singing on a lot of the album. Some of it credited, some of it uncredited. And as he said, I'm all over that album. And I can tell because there are shades of drama in there. You can hear the difference in the backing vocals. And Trevor was a very, very important part of that whole setup because, he'd written a lot of the songs. A lot of the album was written before they got the deal and before, as Tony Kaye said, the record company, once they heard Jon was involved, saw dollars, saw yes, and that was it.
Right.
End of. And, it was a done deal. And Trevor wasn't that happy about that. But, he kind of got used to it, I guess.
Yeah, I think it turned out to be the right choice. So at least in that case, the record company knew what they were talking about.
Yeah, I think so.
Look up, look down, look out, look around, look up, look down. There's a crazy world outside. We're not about to lose our pride. It can happen to you, it can happen to me, it can happen to everyone eventually. As you happen to say, it can happen today. As it happens in every way.
All right, Jon, what do you have for your 4th choice?
Well, my 4th choice is the follow-up album to Tales from Topographic Oceans, Relayer. And I have to say, when I first heard Relayer, and it was 3 tracks, which is very Close to the Edge, that just had 3 tracks on. And I just thought, right, great. Patrick Moraz, I loved him with Refugee. This is going to be great. And it was a really hard album for me to get into. Once I got into it, I loved it. But I can remember thinking, wow, what is this? I mean, it was very jazz rock. Sound Chaser sounded like something the Mahavishnu Orchestra might have done. And I think that the funny thing is, one of the stories about that is that they'd actually auditioned loads and loads of keyboard players, including Vangelis, to replace Rick Wakeman. And when Patrick Moraz was auditioned or asked to audition, Patrick was picked up by Brian Lane, and Brian apologized because he was only picking him up in his Jaguar. He said, "My Rolls Royce is being fixed in the garage," apparently. That was the quote. And they went round to Chris Squires, and Vangelis's equipment was still set up, and they said, "Well, okay, we're going to play something. What would you play along to that?" So he said, "I spent some time tuning it all up, all the keyboards up." And then I listened to it again, and then I played something on Sound Chaser, and he said that actually ended up on the album. My audition ended up on the album, the finished album. But it was very, very jazz orientated, which I think came from Patrick, because Patrick, had his finger in lots of different pies, but jazz was certainly one of them. But once I got into it, I really, really enjoyed it. And of course, Gates of Delirium. I mean, who can't like that song? I think every Yes fan has a real soft spot for that particular song. And again, they've done it a few times live over the years. Right. And it's funny because Geoff Downes actually said he'd love to have a go at that. And who knows, maybe on the American tour, maybe they'll do that. Maybe Patrick will jump in with them in Philadelphia. You never know, do you?
Yeah. Well, that'd be great. I had my fingers crossed for that in London at the Palladium show. Some of the band members had slightly hinted at that, but it didn't happen. But the Americans will get it, I'm sure. One of the things I noticed, I was just in doing a bit of research for one of the future podcasts, was actually the timeline around that, because I was just trying to work it out, and from what I can gather, Rick Wakeman left in the middle of May '74, and Relayer came out at the end of November, so it came out less than 6 months after he left. And as you said, John, they tried out a lot of keyboard players. So as far as I can gather, Mraz actually first hooked up with them in about August
the 4th.
Yeah. There you go. There's the exact day. I'll go and update.
But
so August the 4th to November the 20th. Again, it's 3 months, to put all of that together and put it out.
But the band had actually been working on it, because Rick had heard the material and he said, there's no way I wanted to go there. He said, I'd already heard the material, and he said that all that big tour to promote it, he said, was booked. And I just told Brian Lane I couldn't do it. And Brian Lane told Rick, look, swallow your pride. You're going to earn a lot of money. Do it. And he said, no, I can't. And they tried a few of the people, and they tried people like Blue Weaver, who'd been in the Strawbs. They asked him. They asked Cat Stevens, keyboard player, I think Jean Rousseau, and obviously Vangelis. They asked Blue Weaver. Blue Weaver said, there's no way I'm good enough for that. Why don't you get Tony Kaye back in? And then sort of Patrick's name came up. So, I mean, and I think Patrick was the right guy at the right time. I mean, he was in very much the way that Rick was the right guy at the right time when he joined for Fragile. I think it's quite funny how that happened for Patrick as well, similar way.
Stand and fight, we do consider they mind it all, and in a pact between us, unseen as we go. And right there, emotion to music blends of honor. Stand and watch us, soaring talents, peaceful lives will not be never freedom. Fight till we know. Destroy oppression. Reaction as leaders look to you, attacking
Going straight from that, I'm gonna go right into the next album that came right after for my number 3, which is Going for the One. And what happened with the band at that time, I guess they had this run of albums every year leading up to Relayer, and then they took a few years off for Going for the One. And maybe you can shed some light into that, John. But that's an album that, God, I love the diversity of it. I think it's an amazing album, from the title track, which is like this crazy rocker, to, of course, Awaken, which is this amazing epic that the John Anderson, Trevor Rabin, Rick Wakeman lineup going on tour has been playing, and even doing an extended version of it. It's fantastic. But I like the, Wondrous Stories is a beautiful little ballad. Parallels is great. I mean, the whole album is flawless. I think it's underrated, actually, for being one of their better albums, and one that, I think really holds up.
Well, it's not underrated by me, as you will hear at some point. So there you go. But it was started with Patrick still in the band, and work on that had started a good, I think it came out sort of late spring, was it 77? But work had begun in 76 on that album. And Patrick had worked on that. And of course, when Patrick left the band, the end of '76, they kind of removed all the bits that he'd already recorded. Because it was partially recorded at that point. And they recorded it in Switzerland for tax reasons, like a lot of other bands do. They record out of the country for tax reasons, because if you record in the UK, at that point, tax in the UK was something silly like 90 pence in the pound or something. So it just wasn't worthwhile. So they kind of took a year out, like a lot of bands did at that time. But it was recorded in Switzerland. And of course, Patrick being Swiss, that seemed an ideal situation. Sadly, it didn't work out for him or the band. I always wonder what it would have sounded like with Patrick in the band. And I kind of have an idea, but I will always forever wonder what it will sound like.
Awaken is so Rick Wakeman identified, right? The opening and his playing on that. It seems like it couldn't be anybody else.
And yet, Patrick, that's one of the songs Patrick played on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you should say that. I mean, I think Rick, whatever Rick plays, it's undoubted. You can spot Rick a mile away. And I don't mean that he's predictable in any way. He just has a certain Rick Wakeman.
He has his sound for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Patrick, Patrick claims credit, I think, for I'll get musical and a bit boring, but that cycle of fifths, the circular chord pattern that large parts of Awaken are based on. I think he has said that was his idea, and he in fact uses it in one of the songs, I think, on the solo album that he recorded straight after leaving.
And if you think about that, actually he's right. You can go, actually, yes, I understand that. I mean, if you understand music a little bit and you know where Patrick's come from and the sort of things that he does, you go, actually, yes. Which isn't to say that yes, sort of ripped him off, anything but I think at the time Patrick probably had every good reason to say that he had a good hand in that.
Yeah. Geoff, what do you got?
Well, I'm going to save you time here, Roy, because I can answer it in 3 words. What he said. My number 3 was Going for the One.
Oh, okay.
And again, all that you've said. An album with great playing, great production, brilliant arrangements. Turn of the century, a beautiful arrangement. Awaken, just incredible. The thing that struck me actually with a lot of what we've talked about here, and I suppose my first 3 choices were Keys to Ascension, 90125, and Going for the One. It struck me when I got to this point in my list that those were all albums of fresh starts. So reinvigorated band, new members. Now I know lineups change a lot, but it's interesting when you look at the albums that come after Going for the One and after 90125. That often the momentum of that energy of the fresh lineup sometimes does not continue on, but I'm not going to prejudge anybody else's subsequent choices. Who knows? Tormato might be everybody's number 1.
Well, another great track on that album, of course, is Parallels, which was originally going to be on Fish Out of Water. That was going to be a track on Fish Out of Water, but as Chris said, they ran out of time. He said, I thought it may be a bit too different, but I said, well, in hindsight, I can see it fitting on Fish Out of Water, but it's a great track. And of course, they opened up the live set on the Going for the One tour with Parallels.
Yeah, you know what else is interesting about Going for the One? It was that it's the first album cover, I guess, in a series that had come before it that wasn't Roger Dean.
Well, there's a reason for that. The reason being, it was going to be the best Yes sleeve that Roger had done. And he went to meet with Jon, and Jon was painting flowers, and he said, this is what I want on the cover. And Roger said, no, I'm not doing that. That was that. So they decided to part ways a little bit. And of course, he didn't he didn't draw the sleeve or paint the sleeve for going for the one or the next album, Tomato, but he returned eventually, thankfully.
Yes, that's right. Guys, is any artist more identified with a band than Roger Dean with Yes? I mean, it's like that's his work is that band's look. I mean, I can't think of another one. Maybe Storm with Pink Floyd, I guess.
Yeah,
would be the other one.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, John, are you we have a trifecta here going for the one or
No. My third album is what most people will probably call the definitive Yes album, and that's Close to the Edge. And I can remember, as I've said, watching Yes, and they were on the TV, and it was a concert live from the Rainbow. And the first song that pulled me in was a track called And You and I, which of course features on Close to the Edge. And I remember going to get the album, and I felt a little shortchanged at the time because it only had 3 tracks on it. Right. And again, at that point, I was 14. So again, you have to bear in mind that my musical taste was, if you like, molded by the Beatles and the Stones, and you know, most albums had 12 tracks on. What's this? Three tracks? What I didn't realize that one of the tracks was 20 minutes long, another one was 10, and the other one was 8. So you know, you did get value for money, but I still think And You and I, it's one of my favorite Yes songs. I love it. There have been moments where it's brought me to tears. It's just a wonderful, uplifting piece of music. And for that alone, it's worth buying the album. And I do, but I love the title track, Close to the Edge, which the band have performed a lot over the last few years. And of course, Siberian Khatru. Does anybody know what a Siberian Khatru is? I don't.
I think I might have looked it up once, but I don't remember if I found an answer.
Yeah, I haven't found an answer yet. Not one that I believe in, anyway. Let's put it that way. But but great album.
Yeah, I love the diversity of those 3 songs, even as long as they all are. But they're all completely different and offer a take on the Yes sound. But yeah, I feel like And You and I is sort of definitive John Anderson, you know, the way his vocals on that, the songwriting.
An interesting thing is Bill Bruford never got to play any of those tracks live until Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman Howe performed. He said he would stay for the tour, and Steve Howe said, no, if you're going to go, you should go now. And Steve Howe said, I always regret telling him that. And fair play to Alan White, who'd actually, when Bill disappeared once, he's a friend of Eddie Offutt's, and he came down to the rehearsals. And Bill had to go somewhere, probably to go for, I don't know, a cup of tea with Robert Fripp, perhaps. But Eddie said, well, look, Alan will sit in for if you want to carry on playing. And the very first song that Alan played with Yes was Siberian Khatru. So that was in their rehearsal room. And then they went to see him playing with Joe Cocker and said, look, we're going to America in 3 days. Do you fancy joining? And he said, yeah. He said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give each other 3 months. If we like each other, then we'll see how it goes. And as Alan said, I've been there ever since. But he said it was great. And he said, I was listening to the songs all the way over on the plane. And he said, the first 3 gigs were great. And he said on the 4th night, whatever happened, he said, that was when the wheel fell off. So, but he said the first 3 gigs were really, really good. And the first time they played Close to the Edge in its entirety was at Crystal Palace, which was Alan's British debut with the band in September 1972. But it's still a remarkable album. And I do feel that a lot of Yes fans would say that is their definitive album, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Changed only for a sight, the sound of space agreed. Between the picture of time behind the face of me. Coming quickly to terms of all expression laid. Emotion revealed is the ocean.
Okay, we're getting into sort of the big choices here. My number 2 is going to be, Geoff, you referred to this one, but I have it ranked as my second, is 90125. Simply because, like I said, it was the album that introduced me to the band, and I had my cassette of it with my Walkman, and I wore it to pieces. I mean, I love that album. The song still hold up for me today, and even seeing the recent tours live when they're playing like "Hold On" and "Changes" and some of those songs, I think is great. "Owner of a Lonely Heart" was honestly my least favorite song on the album. It was a good song. I didn't think it was any better than anything else. I actually thought everything else was superior to that song. But that's always been my MO. I always think the hits are worse than the other songs on the album. But I that sound for me, that early 80s pop prog sound that Asia was doing, and that Yes did, and that Genesis was doing with like the self-titled Mama album and Abacab, and I love that era of music because it sort of mixed that hard rock sound with enough prog soloing and keyboards to make it interesting, and it wasn't that formulaic as things would get later down the line. So I'm a big fan of that early 80s era of those bands, and I think they did some amazing work. Looking back now, it's not my favorite stuff compared to the 70s, the classic Genesis, classic Yes, etc. But I have to give this album its props for introducing me to that music. So my number 2 is 90125.
Absolutely. And I think its very existence, for good or for bad, is probably the reason why we still have a Yes today. I think, it took them to a new level when things unfortunately were not going the right direction. It's not on my list, but I'm a huge fan of Drama. I love the Drama album. I love Trevor Horn. I love his voice. Particularly, and again, not on my list, but the rework of Fly From Here with his vocals on it, again, just incredible Yes music. And I think Trevor has a lot to be thanked for in the Yes history for both his contribution as a singer, but also for making this album something that actually gave the band the shot in the arm that brought them through the 80s, where some of their peers, failed. ELP, we talked, Genesis went a different direction, but there were other bands whose work pretty much dried up.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Geoff. And the two things that I remember about 90125. The first thing, most people, in fact, everyone I knew at the time said, "This is Yes." So that was one thing I always remember about it. But the second thing is, if you think about a lot of albums that came out into the 80s, and we were 3 years into the 80s, they always say the decade never really begins until the second year of that decade. So we were 2 years into the 80s using that as a yardstick. And unfortunately, a lot of 80s records, singles and albums, they're blighted by production techniques. That there's sometimes some great songs, but the production sounds very dated now. And the one thing you can say about 90125 is that it has not dated at all. That could have been done yesterday. And that I put down to Trevor Horn. He's an amazing producer. That album does not sound dated in any way at all. The fact that they're all great songs on there is beside the point, because a great song is always going to be a great song, but some great songs were ruined or sound ruined now in comparison by the production techniques, and the production techniques on 90125 definitely are absolutely spot on. They haven't dated in any way at all, and I think that is a very big tribute and a very big tick in the box for Trevor Horn.
Okay, Geoff, your number 2.
Okay, my number 2, it's already been put out there already. I had a hard choice between number 1 and number 2, but my number 2 is Close to the Edge. Again, it's been said, and to an extent already, but there's so much on that album that is actually a real blueprint for what we know as progressive rock going forward. The combination of acoustic and electric keyboards and guitars, again, the arrangements, longer tracks, the virtuosity, the moogs, the mellotrons, everything that Rick does best is typified on there. And again, as has been said before, the songs that make up that album, all of them have been the bedrock of Yes's set lists pretty much since that time. I'm sure there's virtually not been a concert that A New and I hasn't been played at, and usually with one or other of the other tracks on it. And to an extent, you can sort of see, why Bill Bruford was going, well, where do we go from here? Because to me, it's the album that just fully achieved, everything that had gone before from the band formed. And it's not to say that everything else afterwards, great music, great material. That to me, just in the genre, is an absolute standout album.
Well, it's amazing because it was their fifth album. It was really early, fifth album in 3 years, right? So it's really right at the beginning where they were just firing, like insane material was coming out all at once, and it ends up being their best work to this day. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Steve Howe said that the longest track I think they'd done was probably Starship Trooper before that. And it's like, that was quite long, but he said, then we're going to do something like nearly 20 minutes long, double the length. And he said we were really pushing the boundaries there. And Bill Bruford also commented about the album. He said, at that point, he said, I didn't think I could make a good album or an album as good as that. But yes, I think that's as good as it's going to be for me. I think it's time to move on.
Yeah.
But also, he said, I remember in the early days, and he said, I can remember falling asleep on one of the night sessions, and Chris Squire is playing over just 4 bars of music. And he said, I woke up and Chris is still playing the same 4 bars of music. And he said, I thought then, there's got to be a better way. And he said, the other thing that worried me is, he said that when they started splicing the multi-track tape, he said, when they start splicing the 2-inch tape, and I'm thinking, what are you doing? So he said, I thought that, it's great. Thankfully, it all worked out to be really good. But he said, I thought, I'm not going to make a better album with Yes than this. And I think it's time for me to move on, which is what he did with King Crimson, of course, which is probably the best musical decision he could ever make.
Yeah.
Because I'm not altogether sure Bill, I really don't think Bill would have been suited to Tales from Topographic Oceans, with the greatest respect to Bill Bruford, who's a wonderful musician. But I think he made the right decision.
Your number 2, John?
I can remember in 1978 when Tormato came out, not being very impressed. And I think it's, in hindsight, that there's still like parts of Tormato. There's some great songs on there, but unfortunately it kind of followed a really, really good album, which was Going for the One. And when Drama came out, of course, we knew by then that the Buggles had joined. How dare they? A pop band joining Yes. And when I heard the album, of course, the opening track is Machine Messiah, and I thought, hang on, that sounds like Yes. And it was, because Eddie Offord had come back briefly, helped with the backing tracks. The sleeve was designed by Roger Dean, and it sounded like Yes. And I thought, Yeah, but there's something slightly different here. And yes, it actually moved it on again. But again, people moan about the Buggles coming in. What a lot of people don't realise that at one point, yes, they were actually considering just being a three-piece, Alan, Chris and Steve. And it was only because Geoff Downes and Trevor Horn were managed by Brian Lane as well as the Buggles. And they thought, well, because Trevor Horn was a huge Yes fan, as was Geoff Downes, and they'd written this song, "You Can Fly From Here." And Chris said, well, let's hear it. And of course, Trevor kept saying, well, where's John and Rick? And well, don't worry about that. We'll sort that. And then they said, well, actually, they're not in the band anymore. Do you fancy joining? And Chris said, that was great. But he said, then I had to go and persuade Jill Sinclair, who was Trevor's wife, to allow him to join the band. But he said it all worked out. But I remember hearing Machine Messiah and thinking, it's going to be great. And when I went to see them on the tour, and I saw them a few times on the tour, and it was a bit hit and miss. And I've never understood why people pay good money to go and boo and shout things out at bands, but it was happening on the UK tour. And as Geoff said, well, when we played London, they were even booing at the Rainbow. And I think he explained it quite well. He said, I was the third or fourth, I think it was the fourth keyboard player in Yes at the time. So he said the pressure wasn't really on me because they'd already replaced the keyboard player 4 times. They'd never replaced John Anderson. And he said that was the difficult thing. And you'll know this, Geoff. He said, one of the reviews said, it's like Yes being fronted by Ronnie Corbett.
That's right.
and I remember that review. It was in the Sounds, actually. And it was very unkind because I think Trevor did a wonderful job. And I just think that Trevor's problem, and he agreed, he said, if I could do it again, he said, I'd get a voice coach. He said, because I didn't realize singing live was, he said, sometimes I just overreached myself. And Chris Squire said, there are times when he was great. He said, I remember once in Texas, I told him, you sang And You and I Tonight as well. In fact, maybe better than John Anderson would have done it. But he said he just wasn't consistent enough. And Trevor agreed. He said, I'd never toured at that level before. And that was my problem. I oversimplified it and thought, it's going to be okay. And he said it was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. So, is your number 2 drama then?
It is, yeah.
Okay. That's what I figured.
I'm fairly sure that based on the fact that it anything hasn't ever appeared, but to me, one of the great holy grails of Yes fandom for me would be, a proper live drama recording or indeed film. And I think even whenever they put together the In a Word live box set, they just use some sort of tidied up FM radio tracks.
I can tell you why that is. They were going to do one.
Right.
And it was going to be recorded at Madison Square Garden. And there was some deal done that brought, they of course, as Geoff said, there was always a deal going on with Yes. And he said the deal was on, we were going to record it properly, 24 track, and then the deal was off. So that all the equipment was shipped out. And then the next day, the day before the gig, the deal was on again, but we didn't have time to get all the recording gear back in. And it was for the King Biscuit Flower Hour. So he said, all we had to do was a stereo feed out of the desk. And any live songs from the drama tour come from Steve Howe's personal archive. And it's funny because the Going for the One tour wasn't filmed or recorded either, which is odd. I know there's a film of the band in Glasgow, but that was actually made by Steve Howe's brother. And it was only a purely amateur thing. Let's film it and see how we get on. But I agree. I would love to have heard a live album from the drama tour and maybe seen some footage.
More in the mind than the body.
right, so my number one has been mentioned again, but I think I had to put it there, which is Close to the Edge. I think we spoke about all the merits of it. Real quick, just going back and rediscovering the classic catalog. I just have been over the many years impressed with that album, and finally when I got to see it live, it sort of solidified it for me, because stuff like the title track makes no sense on how it came together, and yet they pull it off live somehow. 5 people playing completely different things in completely different time signatures, and it works, and it's genius. So I'm going to keep it short because we talked about it a lot, but that's my number one choice.
And I think that album probably had a big hand in defining progressive rock music as well.
Yeah,
a lot of people forget that.
Not just the songs, even the coolness, simplicity of the album cover is cool. The groundbreaking of one song covering one side and only 3 tracks, and everything about it. They sort of were trying new things, and that kind of stuff is what has things stay at the top for so many years. All right, so Geoff, what's your number one? I'm curious. I don't know where you're going.
Well, this is my other curveball then, I suppose. The Union album is not my number one. No, so my number one album is the Yes Songs live album. I think if I had to be left, with one Yes album, that would be the one that I would pick. And if you look at it on the face of it, I mean, Jon mentioned that his first experience was this. The album itself is not particularly well recorded, but the performances are absolutely electric, and it's why I am comfortable with a top 5 that doesn't include the Yes album, because virtually all the Yes album tracks are on this one, and played with, I think, a renewed vigor and energy that Alan White brings to the band. It's also, of course, got all of the Close to the Edge album on it. In fact, the other night I actually put on my vinyl of Yes Songs, and just listening to the start of Close to the Edge, and I actually went over and checked the turntable to see whether it was on at the right speed, because they are playing. It is played so fast and with such amazing, accuracy and energy. And great. Again, I don't have Fragile on my list, but at least if I've got this album, I've got a brilliant version of Heart of the Sunrise. Great versions of Roundabout. The ultimate, I think, version of The Fish. Turning it from a sort of album-filling ditty into a full kind of bass and drums exploration. Great versions of, I've Seen All Good People, Perpetual Change. So to me, it's the one album that, if I was to say this sort of sums up an awful lot of what Yes is about, that would be the one that would be number one for me.
I agree with you there, to be honest with you. And I also think as well, the packaging has a lot to do with it as well. Yeah. I remember when that came out, I pored over that sleeve for hours. I'd play it and I'd pore over that sleeve for hours and look at the photos, the credits. And I think you're right, the sonic side of things is not the best. And Alan White's not a big fan, because he said, I'd only just joined the band and I would have liked a bit more time under my belt, but he said it captures the moment. And the other funny thing is, well, you're probably aware of all the Pangyric reissues with all the extra stuff on and things like that, and the Stephen Wilson remixes. Pangyric wanted to do Yes Songs, but unfortunately the master tapes have gone missing. Wow. So they can't do it. And I'm hoping that at some point, because these things, they're mislaid. Like, for instance, they recently in the last few years found that the multi-track recordings for the QPR concert, and I'm hoping that the same can sort of happen for Yes Songs, because I would love to hear it remixed by Stephen Wilson. Yeah. I think if anybody can sort of put a slant on it and bring it right up to date, I think Stephen Wilson could do it with Yes Songs. But you're absolutely right. It's a defining moment.
Well, what's cool about it too, I mean, the track listing alone, it's like a greatest hits. I mean, it captures those 3 stellar albums that preceded it, all the great songs from it. I mean, that should be they could do that tour right now with just those songs and get away with it just fine.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice choice and a nice curveball, but I think that's a good inclusion.
I see the winds come
All right, John, let's see what you have at number 1.
Okay, well, my number 1 has moved up from your number 3. My number 1 is Going for the One.
All right.
And it's my favorite Yes album for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's the classic lineup back together. In other words, Wakeman, White, Squire, Howe, and Anderson. And I think it's the best of both worlds because we'd had 2 albums previous which had just been long pieces. And this was a good mix of the longer tracks and the shorter tracks. And I must say that the cover is not the greatest cover in the world. It was done by Hypnosis, as was the following album, Tomato, but it's okay. It was very up the times. But musically, I don't think there is a wasted moment on this album. I think every track is a winner. And it's hard to find an album where every track is a winner. I mean, there'll always be a few tracks that you maybe skip well, I'm not that big a fan of that one, but every single track for me on Going for the One is an absolute winner. And that is why it's my favorite Yes album.
Yeah.
I think is it the that and Close to the Edge are the 2 albums we each have. So yeah, I think that makes sense. I would agree there.
And I think the other thing about it is, I didn't say this when I was talking about it, I don't think, is that, you know, all of the 5 songs are incredibly different from each other. You know, you've got the bombast of Awaken, you've got Turn of the Century, which is very, very arranged, but is more acoustic and lighter and builds. And then, you know, you've got Going for the One, the full on, you know, just straight rock song. Yeah, as straight a rock song as Yes can manage. You've got Parallels, which is, you know, the organ, it's sort of orchestral. And you've got Wondrous Stories, which is a very sort of light, flowy, Jon, again, slightly acoustic-y track. You know, it's just a really, really varied album as well.
Yeah, it's an easy listen. You know, you could put that thing on and like you're saying, the songs in the beginning aren't that long and they just sort of breeze by and they're pleasant and you just enjoy it and it's dynamic and everything that's going on, and then you have the epic ending song which kind of can hypnotize you. It's a really good listen from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I think as well with the actual album as a whole, and a lot of people probably don't understand this, but the programming of the album, the way the tracks are actually programmed on the album, that's very, very important, and I think that's exactly right for Going for the One as well. And I think as well, because if you think about it, Parallels came from a solo project of Chris's. And I also think that on the title track, I mean, I don't think Yes had ever rocked as hard as that at the time. I think, wow, everyone was like, wow. Yeah. I mean, some people said that's Yes's punk album. I wouldn't go that far. But I mean, as they say in America, they kicked ass on that particular track, you know?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I like, Chris's bass is really up front on that one too, which is really, I mean, he always had this unique cutting bass sound that really stood out front on most of the recordings, but especially on that song. Which
have you ever heard the backing, Chris's backing vocals on Going for the One?
Yeah, they're absolutely
amazing. What is he singing?
Yeah.
Even Trevor Horn said, yeah, what is he singing on that? It's like, sounds so off the wall and yet so right.
Yeah. There's film around of the Going for the One sessions I've seen on YouTube, and, you know, Chris is that he's actually sitting with an acoustic guitar recording that the backing vocals in that track, and you're going, you know, I mean, it definitely shows his choir boy training that you're singing something that musically, to, you know, it's not kind of normal, and, you know, a normal melody or a normal timing, but yet he just does it to perfection. I mean, again, people, you know, probably you've talked about fish out of water. You know, Chris was an incredible musical musician, if there's such a thing. You know, and he did have all of that training behind him. People credit, you know, Rick for having that, and Alan was involved in a lot of arrangements too, you know, but Chris in particular had an incredible strength in that stuff.
Well, you mentioned the film on YouTube, and I would direct anyone to that, because you go and listen and you think, I don't know, that's not going to work. And yet when you hear it all together, I mean, it's like a complete counterpoint to what the rest of the band are doing. And it's like, and yet it fits like a glove. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's the vision that he must have had for that, because I'm sure he came up with that melody for the harmony. You know, that's a huge talent at work there.
I can't think of a better twosome than the two of you to have on this. And Jon, your stories and knowledge is absolutely unparalleled to this band. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Really.
My pleasure.
And
It's been
again,
great talking to you.
please plug your book again. Where can people get it? Is it
Well,
out?
I think we've sold out of Dialogue, which was the limited edition, but it's coming out and you can get it on Amazon, and it's called Yes, Time and a Word, and it's obviously a lot cheaper than the limited editions were. And it's available on Amazon, and it should be, I think, later this summer. You can pre-order it now. It's called Time and a Word, the Yes Interviews by Jon Kirkman. And and I also have a Genesis book if people are interested in Genesis.
Yes, absolutely.
That's coming out. And you can find that at my website, which is jonkirkman.co.uk. John is Jon.
I do have the deluxe dialogue, but I actually want to wrap it in and put it away and keep it good, because it's an amazing book, and it's glorious. But I just don't. I want it to remain as pristine as I can manage.
Yeah. Well, this is the third edition of the book, so it's sold very, very well, and people have been very, very kind about it. There's a lot of myths that have been busted in the book, because I know the guys in Yes, I know all of them, work with all of them on lots of different projects, and I think that they trust me. God bless them, the fools, but no, they do. And no, they were very, very honest, very, very honest throughout. And I was only asked to take two things out, and I won't tell you which two members asked me to take too little. It was literally just two small things out. And but everything else is straight from the horse's mouth, and there's a lot of myths busted in there. So, and a lot of fans really enjoyed it, and they've been very, very kind. I've received lots and lots of letters from all over the world, and I'm quite humbled by that, because it was a lot of work, and I put my heart and soul into it, and I like to think that shows.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Listen, anybody listening, if you need to know anything about Yes, I'm sure you'll find it from this man. And of course, you can also see Jon again on this year's Cruise to the Edge, which is in February out of Tampa, Florida. I will also be there as well. And Yes, of course, will be there once again, and a slew of amazing other bands. So it's another reason to join us on that ship. So thank you, guys. Thank you very much. We'll see everybody again very soon on the next podcast or whatever else. Please check theprogreport.com for all your information, and we will see you again next time. Thank you.